Howdy folks, Hoss Bossman here to tell you about my top 10 horror films currently streaming on Shudder, and how their disgusting, lascivious nature ultimately aids the leftist takeover of these United Snakes. Shudder is my bread and butter. Shudder is an all-horror streaming app. It's pretty cheap, and they have lots of good stuff. I've been trying to get more political on this channel, as I have been successfully doing on my podcast, Breadsheet. But as I've been saying on that very podcast, I'm gonna have some Halloween fun before the world probably ends on November 3rd. I'm just an artist and disgraced high school English teacher, not for anything weird, and I've always tried to advance leftist or at least progressive causes with everything I do. Whether it's been through explicit preaching in my music, or trying to broaden students' horizons and make them more accepting in apolitical ways, which I think will ultimately lead them to embracing fairer, more compassionate socio-political perspectives. Along these lines, I have to give honorable mention of Blood Quantum, an incredible zombie film made by First Nations or Indigenous folks, First Nations because it is Canadian, that operates as a very well-executed commentary on colonialism and such, as you can imagine. Thought Slime or Scaredy Cats has a great video about the socio-political elements of Blood Quantum, which I'll link in the description. For the record, Thought Slime or Scaredy Matt, I'm not trying to edge in on your territory, being a leftist talking about horror movies. This is mainly a Halloween thing. Now, here's a low-effort listicle about my top 10 favorite movies currently streaming on Shudder. Number 10. Train to Busan. As I will surely say again, I started getting sick of zombie movies over a decade ago, and it was never among my favorite subgenres of horror to begin with. Despite this, I still love a handful of zombie movies. I've seen every Return of the Living Dead movie, the first of which is a masterpiece, the second two of which are worth a watch if you like camp, and the rest are just awful. Train to Busan is a fantastic Korean zombie film about a man going from place to place, most notably a train, to Busan, with his young daughter during a zombie outbreak. It's intense, emotional, and it has this guy in it, Dong Seok Ma. Dong Seok Ma is awesome. Sorry for butchering that pronunciation. I'm doing my best. But Train to Busan features that Korean actor playing one of the most badass and likable characters I've ever seen in any movie. Sung Hwa. Sincerely sorry again for those definitely awful pronunciations of those Korean names, but I tried. That's really all we can ask of each other these days. Train to Busan has everything you want in a survival horror story. The stakes and goals are clear and very personal to our protagonists. The characters are well drawn, and the action will really get your heart pumping. Too much, maybe. The plot is pretty straightforward, but there are several elements that seem to criticize both corporate cruelty and government incompetence, with our protagonists being largely on their own against the corporate-caused zombification virus and only finding hope in cooperating with strangers and looking out for one another. I actually looked it up, and yes, this take is confirmed by actual Korean and Korean-American film critics. As an all-American turd, I think there's socio-political value in watching foreign films in general, even if they don't really have any political messaging, either explicit or implicit. I mean, I'd argue that pretty much any work of art can't help but be political in some way, which is one reason I find it so annoying when people complain about social commentary in films and TV and whatnot by decrying that everything doesn't have to be political. A few years ago, I realized I'd gotten pretty bored by like 90% of the American horror films I was watching. I'll watch almost any horror film. More than any other genre, for me, horror has an incredibly low bar to clear to justify me wasting 90 minutes of my already worthless time on it. But at some point, I realized I was getting very little out of the generic American horror films I was watching, and finding an entertaining American horror film was getting increasingly difficult. This caused me to start actively seeking out foreign horror movies, and in the process, I realized that horror is a fantastic genre to watch just to get some insight into other cultures. Watching Japanese, for instance, horror films is not only great because the approaches and imagery are fairly different from those of American horror cinema, but also because they play on culturally specific anxieties that we just don't really see addressed in non-Japanese cinema. And the same goes for films from any culture outside your own. So just watching foreign films can be implicitly educational, and horror movies can accomplish this in interesting, unique ways. Train to Busan, 8 out of 10 fancies. Number 9. Revenge. This movie rules. It's a rape revenge film, so content warning, which I generally have mixed feelings about these types of movies. I mean, it's always satisfying to see someone torture his or her sexual assaulters, but that invariably means having to sit through a rape scene or some sort of sexual assault scene at some point in the movie, which isn't great. While Revenge does contain such a scene, it's far from gratuitous or exploitative. Mostly happens off screen, but we're still forced to experience just enough of it to make us really want to see the offender suffer, which pays off, I assure you. Probably a big reason that the distasteful but necessary aspects of this film are presented so tastefully is the fact that the director, Coralie Fargiat, sorry for that pronunciation, Fargiat? French. This director is a woman, and she's very good at her job. The movie's neon, teal, orange, red color palette is somewhat reminiscent of Michael Bay's aesthetic, but the director has wildly different foci, and is actually good at making her audience feel emotions and connect with characters. Fargiat is French, which explains why I can't pronounce her name, so there are probably some sensibilities unique to French cinema and or commentaries on aspects of French culture that she brings to this film that I might not be able to pick up on. On a related note, I thought this was a foreign film when I first started watching it, and it is somewhat of a hybrid French-English language movie, but our protagonist is American and dictates most of the movie's presentation or perspective. It's mostly in English. The movie is pretty solidly anti-rape, which I know is a brave take, but I think having a woman helm a film like this was super important. It's a fairly realistic feeling, I assume, depiction of sexual assault, as in it's not a cartoonish masked man leaping from the bushes, but a subtler sense of entitlement, slut-shaming sort of thing, which is far more common and insidious in real life. There are lots of small choices that depict maleness, the toxic strains of it anyway, as this disgusting, selfish, brutish thing, rather than something monstrous and other. I guess it's depicted as something very ordinary, but also very horrific at the same time. I don't know, these are just my brain thoughts. I'm obviously no authority on feminist themes, but this movie is unique, gorgeous, satisfying, fun, horrific, gory, and ultimately, I have to think a lot of women are going to find it pretty empowering. 8 out of 10 fancies for Revenge. Number 8. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I don't need to say much about this one, right? I don't know if there's much social commentary here. I can certainly see some problematic elements in how poor, uneducated white people are portrayed with the whole hillbilly horror thing. Also, there's a physically disabled character whose portrayal I'm sure has been read into, but Tobe Hooper's horror masterpiece is just that. Every horror fan needs to see it. It's not nearly as gory as you might think, but I remember Patton Oswalt's bit about how this film has the best title ever, as in it's like, perfectly describes what the movie is. Maybe I'll play that bit here and risk a copyright strike. Another spookily apt thing I've heard said about this movie is that it feels less like a movie than some private footage you found somewhere. Perhaps in the murderous, cannibalistic family's attic. It's like you're just watching horrific events you really shouldn't be seeing unfold. Highly recommend, of course, 8 out of 10 fancies for Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Number 7. The House of the Devil. I remember hearing mixed reviews about horror director Ty West's early 80s throwback. That's an 80s throwback he made early in his career, not a movie that's a throwback to the early 80s. The House of the Devil. But I absolutely love this movie. It's a fairly slow burn, and some audiences might find the 80s homage element somewhat tacky, especially since 80s homage fatigue is firmly set in the 11 years since this film's release. But an understated, chilling performance from creepy character actor king Tom Noonan, a handful of shocking, out-of-nowhere jump scares, and an overall satisfying aesthetic and feel make this one of my favorite horror films to have been released this century. It really does have a unique feel to it. There's a lot of good stuff to choose from in that category, too. I mean, a lot of great horror movies have come out in the past 20 years. I give House of the Devil 8 out of 10 fancies. Number 6. Mandy. As of right now, this insane, over-the-top, gorgeous film that I first heard described as containing Nicolas Cage at his most unhinged is exclusively streaming on Shudder and has been since its video release. Nicolas Cage at his most unhinged is more than enough to make me stoked about a movie, but this film is pretty enthralling from the jump. I won't say what, but it employs a similar technique to that of the first John Wick to really get us on the side of the protagonist from the first inciting incident. I think it might be even more difficult to watch than hearing a puppy get stomped, so content warning there. The bad guys in Mandy are an evil, acid-dropping cult, which I take some issue with, as I really don't understand how someone could drop acid and proceed to do evil or hurtful things to other living beings, but neither here nor there. But cults are always fun, right? The fairly straightforward story of Mandy sees a satisfyingly unhinged Nick Cage get progressively more head-to-toe blood-caked as he fights his way to the aforementioned cult's top dude. At one point wielding a giant battle axe, another a chainsaw, and lots of other little video gamey weapons in between. This movie is nuts. He sort of progresses his way toward his ultimate goal of revenge in a video game-like fashion, as in it's very linear, but this very much works in the film's favor. It touches on some socio-political topics, namely racism and group mentality, but all in all, it can be enjoyed for what it is on its surface. Mandy gets 8 out of 10, maybe 9 out of 10 fancies. Hey folks, Future Hoss here, recording just my voice because I haven't showered today, which would be fine if my face weren't kinda red and peely because of that. I am still wearing the same shirt from this video though. I decided to split this top 10 list into 2 parts while editing it, as the abrupt ending suggests. Still new at this, and seeing how different approaches are received, would it have been better to keep it as just one video? Sound off in the comment zone down south. I'm dropping this as soon as it's finished on Tuesday, October 27th, 2020, and part 2, or items 5 through 1, should be up just a few hours afterward. Make sure and subscribe and hit the little bell thingy to get notified when that happens, as you'll definitely want to finish the list and hear my super smart brain thoughts about them all at the end. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Hoss_Bossman. Share this video. Come back soon. Check out my podcast, Breadsheet, wherever fine podcasts are given away for free. Support me on Patreon, all that stuff. After Halloween, we're gonna go full brocialist politics on this channel, just a fair warning.